our seminars in Ukrainian studies from the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. So this is our second seminar that's funded by our new Contemporary Ukraine program. I think most of you have this information already, but if you would like a little bit more information about our program, come talk to me afterward. We are bringing in people who work on contemporary topics, and today I am so excited to have my colleague Jay Dickinson, who is an Associate Provost for Academic Affairs at the University of Vermont, and Associate Professor of Anthropology. And she has also served as the Director of Russian and East European Studies at UVM. She's been doing research in Russia and Ukraine since the early 1990s, beginning her work in Siberia before deciding to focus instead on issues of language and identity in rural Ukraine. Since 1995, she has been doing fieldwork in the far eastern area of the Zakarpattia region, working in villages and towns in Rakhivsky, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Among the topics that she's explored during this period have been the transformation of work-based work-based identities during post-Soviet economic transition, language-based identity, and the social implications of the transformation of domestic space over the 20th and 21st centuries. She's currently writing a book based on 25 years of research and has also, writing a book based on 25 years of rural fieldwork in Ukraine, which is entitled Po-Nashomu, Life in a Zakarpattia Village. Her research has also encompassed work in urban areas, including studies of alphabet mixing and outdoor advertising, exploration of Ukrainian comics culture, and most significantly, a new project on Ukrainian Sign Language and deaf identity in Ukraine, including educational experiences of deaf Ukrainian college students. And I should add that her book, which all of us in anthropology are anxiously anticipating, is coming out with our very own Ukrainian Studies Press. So let's please welcome Jay Dickinson.
Thank you, and most of all, thank you to Curie for inviting me. This is, I was telling Olek earlier that this is a really wonderful moment in the process of writing the book to step back and present some of the overarching ideas, and I hope in that spirit of me talking through some images and presenting some themes that we can have lead into a really productive conversation afterwards. I'm not just looking for questions from the audience, I'd also like engagement with ideas. So feel free to push back or to ask me to elaborate or to, I'm not going to say justify, but to offer more concrete support for some of the ideas that I'm going to present here today. So I'm hoping that this will be truly a seminar in that sense. Also, thank you to Emily for thinking of inviting me to speak about contemporary Ukraine. And I am especially happy to have the chance to talk about my beloved Zakarpattia. This is a region of Ukraine that horrifies even Ukrainians that I study. I've had people worry about my safety and my sanity when I tell them that I do rural fieldwork in Zakarpattia, which is, as I will point out here, utterly unjustified and yet utterly understandable when you begin to consider the positionality of Zakarpattia within Ukraine. So today I'm going to talk a lot about migrant labor, not in terms of following migrant laborers as they go out, but rather to take a historical perspective, particularly in the post-Soviet period, in thinking about how both the effect of migrant labor on economic restructuring and on social relations in this village creates, in a way, a network of meaning that has a physical manifestation in the way that people interact with the landscape. So I'm going to be talking about all four of those points: the migrant labor point, the social relations point, the economic restructuring, and also doing that through the medium of seeing how the physical landscape reflects the aspects of this restructuring. So I'm going to begin with a joke, actually, and then I'll explain why I named this section, We Understand Everyone and No One Understands Us. So this joke was told to me this summer by a friend of mine when I had been talking with people about how they think Zakarpattia is perceived in Ukraine, and also what would be the idea of Zakarpattia? What do you think of yourselves? And so she told me a joke, and she knows I collect jokes about migrant laborers. And so she said a Zakarpattia man was fishing, and he caught a golden fish. The golden fish said to him, "I will give you 3 wishes. What would you like for your first wish?" And he said, transport me to the wonders of Dubai. And lo, he was in Dubai, admiring the architecture. And the fish said, what would you like for your second wish? He said, I would like a 20-story house with 100 rooms. And there was a 20-story house in front of him with 100 rooms. And then, you know, he rubbed his hands together, and the fish said, well, what do you want for your third wish? And he said, I want to put all the stucco on by myself. So, this is a joke that gets uproarious laughter in Zakarpattia, where people also joke that a Zakarpattis is born with a trowel in his hand, ready to apply the stucco to the nearest house. This idea of Zakarpattia identity as being defined by an adoration, not just a love of labor, but a true adoration and a self-definition in terms of labor. That labor is the key to happiness. His third wish, the final wish, is that he have enough labor to keep him busy for the rest of his life. And that he, at the end of that, be able to look with pride at his handiwork and say, this is who I am. I am the physical manifestation of my hard work. So, and here is an example. Why is this not? I've got some stuff. Okay. So, and here's an example not from my village, but from a nearby village, of the type of house that is being referred to here. And as a matter of fact, quite recently there was a YouTube series that was about sort of like Zakarpattia cribs, you know, so it was a YouTube series where they would go and interview people about their palatial homes in a village that is actually located just a couple of miles from where I do my field work. And when in those interviews, people will present that very same Zakarpattia ideal. You know, you work and you work and you work so that you can have the house. And then the question is, why do you need this house? And the answer is because so I can have something to work on. It's this circle of labor and identity that ties very much together into the source of all that labor, which is travel abroad. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot are these components of a regional Zakarpattia identity. And this actually emerged out of some conversations I had with scholars in Ukraine in the context of thinking about regional identity. And what many people struggle with from outside Zakarpattia is the fact that that you have this contextually determined nesting of identities, so that you will say the primary way of defining Zakarpattia identity is in that each village is different from the other. And yet, it is the fact that each village is different from each other that defines the Zakarpattia identity. Okay. So some of the components that turn up over and over again, no matter where you are and you're talking to people in Zakarpattia, this concept of being trudolюбиве or robochahe, a desire to demonstrate that hardworking character is manifested through material possessions. Being very mobile, so knowing that Dubai is an architectural center and wanting to go to Dubai, you know, if someone had told that joke 15 years ago, they would have gone to Paris. But being that kind of aware and that mobile, and yet having a firmly grounded local identity, not being someone who wants to emigrate, but rather someone who wants to migrate and repeatedly return, is an aspect of Zakarpattia identity. This concept of nested linguistic identities that are pitched at different levels depending on the component of difference that you're focusing on in the moment. I have witnessed conversations in which people introduce themselves to someone from a place that was a mile away through a presupposed dialect difference. Well, where I come from, we call this X. What do you call it? So that's the conversational opener that people will present. Then at the level of the micro region or the next region up, they might identify and contrast themselves to people from other local linguistically defined groups. They might talk about how one region of Zakarpattia, that Carpathian Basin part of it, is quite different from the hilly part of it, so they'll draw a contrast there. or they might contrast Zakarpattia to other parts of Ukraine. And of course, when they're abroad, they will identify primarily as Ukraine. So this ability to shift seamlessly between identifying only your village as the basis of your Zakarpattia identity, all the way up to the region as the basis of my identity, is very typical of this area. Also, you will see a lot of examples of people presenting Zakarpattia as set apart and almost deliberately inscrutable to outsiders. So they revel in they're both surprised by and revel in the fact that outsiders will identify Zakarpattia as sort of strange or inscrutable, wild. So I often get that adjective applied to Zakarpattia. And then if you look at comedy, and I was going to show an example, but I decided to keep that for another time. Hard drinking, hypermasculine, sort of outdoorsy hunting culture, loud, boisterously humorous, and unfailingly loyal. These are components that are held up in pan-Zakarpattia-based humor, of which there is a great deal. There's a lot of regional humor. So I really appreciate the opportunity to give a talk where I don't have to put up a map of Europe and then a map of Ukraine, and I can just put up a map of Zakarpattia. The reason I chose this one, and this is one from Dzyndzelewski's Linguistic Atlas of Zakarpattia, is this set of isoglosses really demonstrates well that there is a pretty dramatic division starting in the eastern part of Ukraine. This is pretty much Hutsul right here, and this is going to be part of a broader Zakarpattia dialect, particularly this part down here that has a lot of Hungarian influence. And the villages I work in the most are in this area, right in the midst of that transition. And so again, the quote that I had at the beginning is "Мы розуміємо всіх, а нас ніхто," is a reference a woman made to an experience she had where she went to a conference in Ukraine. So she left Zakarpattia and went to Ukraine. And while there, she opened her mouth and someone said, "Are you Polish?" She's like, "Oh, Polish? It's the first time anyone ever thought I was Polish. They usually think I'm Romanian." And then the immediate reaction was, "Good Lord, where are you from?" That someone might mistake you for a Romanian. And she said to them, "Well, we understand everyone. We understand a little Romanian, a little Hungarian. We understand people who speak different dialects in our area. We understand Ukrainians, we understand Poles and Slovaks and Czechs. But when we speak, no one understands us, because our language reflects as well components of all of those pieces, but it somehow makes us inscrutable." Now, in the title, I referenced the biometric passport, and this was part of the transition to the visa-free regime with the EU in 2017. And the reason why I bring this in is because it has been such an important part of conversations in the village where I work, but also more broadly amongst the generation of people in Ukraine who do engage in migrant labor. And so I'm going to argue here that the structures of time and labor that the visa-free regime imposes upon the way that people engage in migrant labor in this area actually have accelerated some of the economic and structural changes that were ongoing but have reached a tipping point in these last couple of years. So a little bit of overview about migrant labor before I turn to talking about the landscape in this area. So I've been looking back through oral histories as well as other available data to think about what kinds of movement and mobility people were engaging in as part of work in not just the post-Soviet period, but going back into the pre-Soviet period in the 20th century. During that period, there was quite a bit of migration from this area to North America. I have people talking about parents and grandparents who migrated to Canada and to the United States, who did work in factories, in mines, and brought back enough cash to be able to purchase a piece of land. So of course many people emigrated and they stayed in North America, but also a number of them returned and used their capital to purchase land and establish a residence. During the Soviet period, there was actually quite a bit of internal migration within the Soviet Union, not just through the process of sending people out, but actually voluntary migration based on expertise. That people in this area have a lot of logging experience and logging technology. So many of them had the opportunity to move to the Baltic states where they engaged in logging activity. And so just to see how these components repeat themselves despite the radically different economic and social context of the Soviet period, just as someone went to North America and brought back capital and used that to purchase land and build a house, one of my neighbors in the village moved to Estonia with her family, and every year, once or twice a year, they would fill a car with building materials like bags of concrete and lime and so forth, and drive from Estonia to Ukraine with building materials that were not available for purchase in Ukraine. So over a period of 10 years, they built a house in Ukraine using building materials that they moved from Estonia as part of a migrant labor experience. And then when the Baltics achieved independence, they decided to move back permanently to Ukraine, where they live in the house that they built while they were doing migrant labor in Estonia during the Soviet period, when you probably would not be thinking of people doing migrant labor. So in the late 1980s and 1990s, people, like everywhere, began to experiment with trader migration, small scale. Take some cigarettes with you, take some vodka, go to Poland, try and stand around and sell it. That, for most people, that did not end up being a permanent occupation choice. Although there are some people who began with trader tourism and trader migration in the early 1990s who have established businesses now doing import-export materials. In the 1990s, you really began to see, the contemporary version of migrant labor take off, with migration to Slovakia and Czech Republic, also slightly later to Russia. Most of the people doing this labor, particularly to Russia, are involved in the building industry. So that trowel that you're born with in your hand, you would go to Russia and renovate apartments, or if you were a highly skilled worker, you would work building the mini mansions on the outskirts of Moscow. Now, the nature of migrant labor in the 1990s was to go for a very long stay. You wanted to avoid border crossings. There was a lot of danger associated with crossing the border in a marginally legal situation. You would rely on a labor contractor to provide you with housing and a job, and you would go and you would stay for 1 to 2 years. During that period, very often people would come home at key points in the year to engage in agricultural labor that was necessary for the household. So you have men going abroad to do migrant labor, you have women and older people staying and managing the household economy, including a significant reliance on growing your own food. So agriculture is a big part of survival during this period. When you move into the mid-2000s, you see more people, the situation in terms of the, I guess you would call it the cultural situation. People began to feel less welcome working in Central Europe, and they began to go to Russia more often. They felt like there was cultural affinity. People understood them, even though there was actually quite a bit of persecution of migrant laborers in various parts of Russia at that time. This is partly due to tighter migration control in Europe. So again, that border crossing is the dangerous part. I remember talking to a woman it was probably 2005, who had just gotten back from Russia. She went to Russia, she earned money. On the way back, someone stole everything on the train. She came back and she was working in a bar because she came back with no money whatsoever. And I said, well, are you gonna go again? She's like, well, yeah, I'll go and try again. So that idea that she had come back with nothing to show for all of that labor, she needed to go back again because working in the bar was also not gonna produce any results. She'd take her chances. after the crash, things got a little rocky for a while. They were starting to pick up again, and then Maidan happens. After Maidan, there was a really much more decisive turn towards Europe for obvious reasons. And I remember people being surprised when I said, yeah, they're still going to Russia. You know, they thought that for some reason people would not still be migrating to Russia to engage in migrant labor after Maidan, but they actually still were for quite some time until it became very difficult. There was also, in terms of Europe, there's been an increase in long-term visa opportunities. So now you have people who are working illegally or semi-legally using the biometric passport parameters, but you also have plenty of people who have actual established work visas and have permission to work abroad. So I mentioned at the beginning the biometric passport and this visa-free regime. What happens with this is that you can go to the EU for 90 days, up to 90 days. You need to demonstrate certain things, you have enough money and so forth. And there's sort of a blind eye turned, and most people can work in intensive seasonal labor for that period of 90 days. Then you're required to leave for at least 90 days, and then you're allowed to come back again. So what you have is these short cyclical stints. They're often seasonally coordinated, and they allow people the opportunity to do a great deal of seasonal short-term work and earn a lot of money in a short period of time that will carry them over during the period when they cannot go back and work. So an example of this is a group of women who went to Czech Republic in the fall and made wreaths, like 18 to 20 hours a day. They just made Christmas wreaths. And then in a couple of months, they were able to earn several $1,000s and return home and do things they really want to do with that money. Make progress on their house renovation, send a child to college or something. Often this is where the cyclical component becomes important. People will choose to do summer work because there are a lot of opportunities to work in the hospitality industry in the summer. That makes them unavailable for agricultural labor at home.
Yes. You mentioned that it's more difficult to work in Russia now. Yeah. Okay. Why is that?
It's difficult to cross the border, and also there's I think a lack of interest in hiring Ukrainian laborers in some of the areas. So people are going to places like Krasnodar and stuff, and there's less interest in hiring laborers from Ukraine to go there. So I know a couple of bus drivers who would drive people for work stints, and they just don't cross the border anymore. So what are some of the emerging values that you see that are related to migrant labor in this, biometric passport age? First of all, this emphasis on a material demonstration of hard work. So in other words, you don't just work hard and be satisfied that your pig is really fat, or that your house is really clean, or that your rows are very neat in your garden. You need a house, you need a car, you need a kitchen that reflects European style. So there's a very material component to demonstrating the fruits of your labor. There's also a generational abandonment. So by generational, I mean younger generation, below 40, abandonment of the idea of a career. I see a lot of people who will pursue some degree of higher education, but then will end up doing migrant labor because they, when given the choice, would choose the material goods over the possibility of a long-term career. Orientation towards a European aesthetic. So a lot of people 10 years ago would have very local aesthetics in terms of decorating their house or purchasing furniture. Now people are being very open about the fact that they are modeling what they put into their own house on something that they saw when they were living or working in Europe. There's an increasing commodification of both labor and time, and this is very much reflected in people saying things like, why would I spend time gardening and producing food when half of what I plant will die? I could use that time doing something else. So they're very transactional in their concept of how the labor that they put in must necessarily yield a specific amount in return. And I'll talk about this at the very end, but reciprocal social exchanges are really still very important. I don't want to imply that reciprocal social exchange is no longer important in this area, but commodification of labor has really undermined these key social exchange points. And the two that I talk about are labor involved in putting on a wedding and labor involved in harvesting. So now I'm going to talk a little bit, show some pictures and talk a little bit about landscape. So this area of Zacualpacha is a transitional landscape. It's not really part of that big, wide, rich soil basin, and it's also not quite in the mountains. You go a little bit further and you're truly in the Carpathian Mountains. So it's a hilly area. There is some arable land, but much of it is on hillsides, so it's challenging to cultivate. And the amount of flat land with really good soil is extremely limited. The soil is very rocky, and low-lying areas are prone to flooding. A little bit more about that in a minute. During the Soviet period, the crops that were grown on the flat portion of land available on the valley floor were wheat and potatoes. They were not particularly successful crops, but they grew them. And these household plots, like the one that's in this picture, are still by some people, but in general in the past were very heavily used to produce staples. So food staples were beans and potatoes, as well as summer squash, and then a lot of feed crops for livestock, corn, squash, beets, and so forth. And you can see how everything is carefully planted to maximize the plant usage of a really limited space that people had to grow in. There's vertical space, there's things planted in between the rows. So I wanted to take a look back. So this is a picture looking down on one half of the village from a particular point. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of landscape alteration. So one of the things that I discovered in my research was that when the communist system came in and they began to do collectivization, there was coincidentally a flood that year. And down here near the church is where the river used to flow. It used to flow over here, and there was a mill right here. They took down the mill, they took down the church, and they moved the river from here about a quarter of a mile over here. So they did this big engineering project to move the river to create a wider space in which to plant wheat for the kolkhoz. And in that process, they also destabilized a number of landowners' claim to that land. So there were two processes going on, both of which resulted in radical landscape change and a complete reorganization of land ownership in the area. So you can sort of think about this in 4 stages. The way that people talk about the period prior to collectivization is the age of Gazde. So these were the big landowners. They controlled landscape and labor. It was a very hierarchical situation. People, this is why people say that they would leave and go to engage in migrant labor. It was not possible to, as a tenant farmer, a servant, or a hired hand, to put together enough capital to be able to purchase and become a landowner. So you had to leave the situation in order to bring that capital back. People talk about this as unfair. It was unequal and unfair, and some people had a monopoly on land and capital. Sovietization in this area occurred in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There was, people will talk very openly about both the coercion and voluntary aspects of collectivization. There was quite a bit of coercion. There was also a lot of unfulfilled promises regarding what you would receive if you agreed to put your land and your animals into the kolkhoz. There was reshaping of the local landscape for collectivized agriculture. What is most interesting to me is that when people look back on this period, they consider it relatively fair. It was probably not fair, they will agree, to take people's animals, and people have memories of, crying and holding onto their cow and so forth, but it was relatively fair because it was redistributed in a way that reflected people's contributions to the whole. So the large landowners' holdings were broken up and people received building plots based on their participation in the kolkhoz. In the post-Soviet period, it took about 6 years after independence before they managed to privatize the kolkhoz land, or start privatizing it. It was, I would call it a moderately corrupt process. So there were components that were certainly corrupt, and then there were components that somewhat followed the requirements of the law. Collective land was physically divided into unique plots. In general, even people who received land in this process considered it unfair. They considered it the beginning of a return to the age of the Gazde. That people will receive land, they've already demonstrated that they can do this in a way that works around the law. Eventually they will consolidate all of their land holdings, and we will work for them, and we will have Gazde again. And then finally, the privatized age, which is this period after 1997. You see a lot of unequal access to capital and resources. There's an emerging, pretty dramatic social inequality that you can visible. So you can see it on the landscape in terms of the size of the houses, the type of land use near the house. Is it given over to agricultural purposes? Is it given over to rose bushes, or so forth? And in general, people look kind of askance at this visible inequality on the landscape. At the same time, they, if they perceive that someone has achieved a large house or a beautiful modern European-style garden through hard work, they are less likely to evaluate that negatively or to consider that that person is abusing their power. So this is a photograph of the land division, actually, in 1997. And the reason why I wanted to show this photograph is you can see in the lower portion how there are cultivated plots that had been in use. This territory here was being primarily used to cut for hay, so it was not, there were no potatoes being grown up here, although they had been previously. But you can see these are all people who managed to bribe someone, and they're all waiting to get their little plot of land. Now, what has happened, these are buildable plots. Virtually all of this land down here is full of houses, so those have all been built on. These less desirable hilly plots up here are still not built. And so you can see this is that was 1997. This is 2004. So you can see that people have fenced in their plots. You can see that people have already started building houses, like that one there. There's another one that's off the screen up here, a quite large house. But people are still not cultivating these plots. So the goal when I talk to people of trying so hard to get their hands on a piece of privatized land was that that would be additional agricultural resources that they could utilize to feed their family. You can see that that never materialized. People never actually use these plots for agriculture. And this is what it looks like today. It's overgrown, and there's really not much going on over there. But if you look down on the valley floor, so if you want to compare, this is in 1990s. Oops, I think you can see here. All of this has been built up with new houses. The number of houses extends much further away, and basically, except for some of these hillier areas, most of the buildable plots that are zoned for building in the village have already been taken. So there's only non-buildable plots left. Yeah.
How big is the village?
Acreage, gosh. I'd say that in terms of, it's strung along a valley floor and then a little bit up the sides of the valley. The village is approximately 2 miles long and probably about 2 miles, well, 1.5 miles wide, and it has 2 forks. So there's like two 2-mile stretches down the valley floor and then a 1 mile cross piece.
And about like 1,100 people?
No, it's actually, technically it's about 6,000 people, but I would agree with you, there's probably between 1,500 and 2,000 that actually live there due to migration and the reduction in the population. So 6,000 is the 1980 Soviet number. This is I mentioned the moving of the river in order to create a larger piece of arable land that could be used for the the establishment of the collective farm. This is a picture of the last year that was cultivated as wheat. So you can see, first of all, not a particularly good wheat field as far as wheat fields go. There's not a lot of wheat going on there. But also, after this, it was actually not harvested anymore. And there were a couple of years where it just sat there, and then they finally privatized that land. It's still zoned for agricultural use only, so you cannot build on it. If they ever change that will be immediately built on. So if you look here, this was the first, like maybe this was about 2 years after they privatized that land. You can see people set up fences. There's a lot of corn that's being grown for fodder for cattle. There's some potatoes, a number of people doing beans down here. So they're relatively small plots, but people were intensively growing on them and utilizing that to supplement their life. Now, this is a couple years later. I'm sorry, there's a wedding in the foreground, but if you look in the background, this is actually the same field. And you can see similarly that it's cultivated with beans and corn. There's some potatoes in the background there and so forth. It's not a very happy looking neighborhood. So this is 2016 or so. Still being cultivated, still being utilized in a number of different ways. You can see there's a haystack back there, so some of it was being used for haying, but in the foreground, lots of cultivation for staple crops like beans, for example. But this is what's going on there now. In the last 2 years, people have almost completely stopped utilizing this land for agricultural purposes. They use it for hay, and there's one plot here that has some beans on it, and this plot over here also has some peas and beans and squash on it. But a lot of this is just sitting there. And the reason is that there is no one who wants to buy the hay and no one who's available to harvest the hay. So we've finally reached that tipping point where the structure of migrant labor and the economic motivation to engage in small-scale agriculture have combined to create a collapse of this agricultural system. Now, another way that we can see social relations on the landscape is to look at actual domestic space in houses. So the last set of slides was really focused on how are people utilizing land for landy agricultural purposes. This is about how people are changing the built landscape to meet value-laden ideas of what one should be doing with one's land, with one's money, with one's time. So here is an example. You can see an older house. This house is probably from the 1940s in the foreground. In the background, very typical contemporary house, probably not even that new. It's probably about 10 years old, with an elaborate fence around it, a little balcony with some ironwork. It's all nicely stuccoed. It's got 2 floors and so on and so forth. There's a big difference between both the interior and exterior spaces that you experience in each of these. So 2018 data from the World Bank and the National Bank of Ukraine, so 2 separate studies, showed that there has been a continued increase in migrant labor to Europe from Ukraine. And then I'm sure all of you have seen numbers similar to this, that the amount of money sent back to Ukraine by migrant laborers is estimated to be equivalent to about 11% of Ukraine's GDP. So really significant amount of money. But there's a number of studies that have shown that the goal that people have in going abroad for migrant labor is actually, they have very specific goals. One of them is to build a house in Ukraine, so not to emigrate, but to earn money to build a house in Ukraine. And another one is to be able to pay for a child's education. So you see people having very specific goals and in the amount of earning that they like to do. Now, this is also a very typical scene. Someone has received a building plot and they want to hold it down. They put in a foundation and then they go abroad to work, and it sits there as they struggle to get enough money to raise the house off the ground. So around the village, you'll actually see what appear to be empty spaces, but they're being held. And they're being held for the future house that will sit there, as opposed to previously, there's actually a house on either side here. Previously, this would have been cultivated land that was being used by people living in the houses to produce food for daily living. The question arises of why you see such a decrease in this type of cultivation. And there are a number of factors that are coming together, but here you have one of them. You have someone from an older generation who is available to do the daily labor of, you know, cutting grass, weeding, cultivating, doing all of those things. In fact, if you have most of the people between the ages of 18 and 45 abroad during the prime agricultural months of the year, you can't maintain any kind of growing activity. So you have to rely on those that are back. Previously, what people would do is they would rotate out and they would come home to engage in specific kinds of labor. They're not able to do that. So a few examples of houses. This is one that was built in the beginning of it's probably 1920s. It's built in the first part of the 20th century. Very typical small two-room house, and very little land near it. Sort of perched on a part of that would not be a particularly desirable area because it's hilly, so you wouldn't be able to cultivate this in any kind of. And you can't see it, I think, over on this side. Also, typically attached to the house, you would have a pen where you might keep pigs, for example, or a cow. This is a house that was built in the early 1970s. There are many houses with a very similar footprint in the village. It's a wood house with stucco on it, one floor with a storage space above, and 3 rooms inside. It did not have a kitchen in it, and the kitchen was added as part of a renovation process a couple of years ago. Now, since this photograph was taken, they've built an addition on the side, and their plan is to complete the addition because the husband is actually doing migrant labor in Czech Republic right now as we speak, to add an addition over here that they will move into and leave the main house for their daughter. This is another model that you see, a house that was built. This is actually a kitchen that has been completely rebuilt. It was a small one-room house that was transformed into a 2-room summer kitchen, and then was transformed into a full house with a kitchen, gas, running water, all of those things. While this main home, which is quite large in footprint, and so it's probably at least a 1,500 square foot house that has 4 rooms in it, with a lot of marble and so on and so forth. That was built for their son while they were living in the summer kitchen, and then he lives there now with his wife and children. And this is just another example of the type of architecture that you're going to see that demonstrates that you have been able to earn enough money to be able to build a 2-story home with particular architectural features, satellite TV, and so on. Now, in contrast, you can see this is a very typical interior of a house from the beginning of the 20th century. It still has the stenciled painted walls. You can see the proportions of the doorways, thick walls, everything very heavy, lots of handwork, these old Czech plates that are used as decorative items in older homes, and lots of clutter. Contemporary spaces, when I talk to people about them, they said the most important thing is for a house to be what they called comfortno. And by that they mean with a place for everything so that you could reduce clutter and there could be a lot of convenience. So this person actually felt that her kitchen was too cluttered, and she actually redesigned the whole thing so that it now has flat, everything is flat, everything is tucked away, there's nothing visible on the countertops and so forth. So that process of taking the very Soviet style large shelving units that had a lot of space for things that needed to be dusted, removing those and replacing them with modern flat-fronted cabinets where everything is tucked away and is easy to put away or to take out again, is typical of a modern aesthetic that you see people consciously developing. and paying to see achieved in their homes. Now the last thing I want to talk about, you'll notice I say counting cows, but there's actually no cows in that photograph. The last thing I want to talk about is a conversation I had with some women that, where I asked them about changes in life in the village over the past 5 to 10 years. And one of them said, well, you know, my friend and I sat down and we counted the cows on our street. And she gave a particular distance, and she said, there's only 8 cows left. And then someone else in the group said, I just counted the cows on my street, and there's only 2 cows left. So everyone in the group had to tell me how many cows were left on their street. And this prompted me to actually go and look at the Agricultural Bureau's statistics for, you know, the large horned cattle in the region, and they have been steadily declining considerably over time. There's also been a recent decrease in pigs as well, but an increase in fowl. So there's a lot more chickens and geese that are being held, and many fewer cows. And I'll talk about why that's significant. Why do cows matter? Cows, it used to be the pinnacle of sort of self-sufficiency, to be able to have a cow, to keep a cow, gave you milk and milk products. It gave you meat. You could have calves and either sell the calves for money, or you could slaughter the calves and have meat. It was a big investment of time and energy, year-round labor, but you got a great deal in return for that investment. So the value is predicated on, first of all, a lack of supply of local dairy and meat. You could not really purchase it easily. And the other thing that it was predicated on is a lack of commodification of labor that you do for your own agricultural production. It doesn't matter how much time you spend on it, because it's just time, right? So if you invest that time and you get all these things out of it, you're not going to parse that up and say, it's taking too much time for me to have this milk. You're going to say it's important to have. It's also a long-term commitment for the, you know, not necessarily for the life of the cow, but it's certainly a much more significant commitment than pigs, which are an annual investment of labor and money, and chickens, which are an even shorter investment of labor. So the other thing that was really important about having a cow was they enabled you to participate in labor and food exchanges in a way that you could not if you did not have a cow. So for example, you could trade milk to your neighbors. You could provide cheese for a number of different purposes. You could have a calf that you were preparing to be able to serve meat at a wedding. All of these things were important long-term planning components of investing in a cow. And I'm starting to wonder whether, as the women seem to feel, that the disappearance of cows is the tipping point. That we have reached the point where people cannot maintain a cow because they don't have the reciprocal exchanges in place to be able to get the hay. Because the people who would be haying are doing migrant labor during the time of year when they would normally come home and help, and it's simply all not worth it in the end because you can go to the supermarket and buy a carton. So the whole system of value has actually finally reached that collapse point where the bedrock of that labor and agricultural production value system has collapsed in this particular village. What are some of the other places you see this? This is a photograph from 1997 of women engaging in a really typical activity that used to go on until about 2014. So I was talking to people about weddings. I interviewed a woman whose wedding was in 2012 and her sister's wedding was in 2014. Her wedding was like this. She said you could tell there was going to be a wedding for 2 weeks before and for a week after, right? You could tell that there had been a wedding. In 2014, her sister had her wedding in a restaurant, and it was like, you know, it happened and then it was gone. It disappeared beneath the waves. So what these women are doing is they're making cabbage rolls for a wedding. They've volunteered their labor, in part because they had, other people had volunteered labor for weddings in their family. And at the end, they all are making cabbage rolls, and whoever reaches the bottle of vodka first got the bottle of vodka. But you opened it and you shared it because it was reciprocal, right? So the labor is reciprocal, but also the prize is reciprocal. You don't actually receive the prize and take it away. You receive the prize and you share it with the people who participated in the labor. So one of the most significant exchanges that has disappeared is that people no longer need to bring food to neighbors for weddings. They don't have to supply eggs for a wedding. They don't have to supply labor for a wedding. They don't have to do anything for a wedding but show up. But they need to put a lot more money down when they go up there and they drink their shot of vodka and give their gift, wedding gift. And people will actually talk about how much they'll commodify their gift in terms of how much they need to give for the amount of food that they plan to eat at the wedding. This is a complete shift in the way that people conceptualize this labor exchange. Similarly, because so few people are haying, the need to be able to assemble a group of people to hay or a group of people to dig potatoes and then have the exchange where they come and they work your land and then the following weekend you might go and work their land. That necessity is slowly disappearing, and that is also disrupting reciprocal relations as well in the village. So people are obviously still connected in a myriad other ways, but some of the important labor exchanges that were not specifically commodified, but they were part of a long-term relationship, have begun to disappear in the light of this change in migrant labor patterns. So I think in conclusion, I began to realize, I think, over the last 5 years that things that I thought were going to remain pretty steady, people's ways of thinking about agricultural labor, about labor that one does for oneself, about their goals in conducting migrant labor and what they would do with the money when they returned, that those things have turned out to be not as stable as I had anticipated. And we're seeing a radical shift in how people think about food and how people think about work and how people think about their relationships with each other, that are all kind of hinging on this value system that's associated with earning money, spending money, and valuing your own work. So I would love to hear some thoughts, discussion, argument based on what I present. Thank you. Oh, sure.
Yes. My question will be in comparison to Galicia, because my department worked a lot with labor migration and how it transforms situation in Galicia. So the first question would be, are there any green tourism signs? Because again, it would be much more labor or money wise just to rent your house instead of keeping pig or whatever livestock. The second question would be, are there any shifts in gender roles? Because what we do observe in Galicia, that we do have a lot of shifts. In majority of cases, those who do labor migration work would be women, and then they have money to say what they want to do or how their husbands are supposed to behave within the family. So we do have a lot of shifts. And also the final question would be about, you said that the aim was to build a house and give education to the kids, but what we observe with a longer run, those goals would shift, because even if they are achieved, they would come, stay very briefly, and then they very soon realize that if they stay, they again coming back to the old gender roles and not paid for the hard domestic work, and they would leave thinking of something else as an extra goal to achieve. And in many cases we would have a situation when they start, after the kids would have education, they would start take them with them. So we would have educated kids, empty houses, and people saying that one day we will come back to what we have there, but in reality they already staying, I don't know, in Italy, in France for 10 or more years.
Yeah, those are all great examples, and the reason I'm so happy that you raised them is that those are all areas where I think in many respects people assume that Galicia is the Ukrainian experience with migrant labor, and in each of those cases it's actually quite different from Zakarpattia. So in the first case, green tourism, it's actually great that you mentioned that, because this picture I had put up here, when I went up to look at this plot with a friend of mine, it was this one right here, on this very day, she said, what I'd like to do is build a little lean-to for green tourism where people could come and stay overnight. And I'm just looking at her like, who on earth is going to come this far out in the middle of nowhere? But I think it's in the air. And it's partly, people are frustrated because the ski resorts that are just a little bit further to the east are incredibly successful and bring a lot of money into that region. And this in-between region, which is also not quite close, they're next to Romania, right? They're not next to Hungary, right? So they don't quite get all of that benefit. They would love to be able to figure out a way to do green tourism. The roads are really bad in this area, so I think bicycling tourism, which would be ideal for this area, is still a little bit far away. But that's a really good question, and it was just peeking out as a new possibility when I was there this summer. Gender. I had a wonderful conversation with people about gender. There are two big changes that have happened. One is more couples going and finding work together, which was very difficult to do for a long time. Some people could do it with factory labor, but now with the hospitality industry jobs that have opened up, there's often gender appropriate jobs for both couples, and they can go together for a short period of time and not have to worry so much about childcare. But when I spoke with women, they said, we finally learned how to deal with men in migrant labor. In the 1990s, this was a real problem. Controlling men, controlling fights over money that men would bring back. And so they said, now you get your man and you lay down the law and you say, you walk in the door and you give the money to me. You don't cross the threshold until the money is in my hand, and then I decide what will happen to it. And the way that you see this is when I interview people, I walk through their houses and talk to them about their ongoing house renovations, and the man would say, I cede everything to her. She makes all of the decisions. So I bring the money and she makes the house beautiful. So she is fulfilling his goal of having a beautiful house, but he is verbally ceding and physically ceding the money and the power of decision making to her. It's very different than it was in the 1990s, where women were really disempowered by not having earning potential, and were not in a position to engage in safe migrant labor in the typical routes from Zakarpattia, which are not to Italy and not to Poland. They're to factory and agricultural labor in Slovakia and Czech Republic, at least from this area. And your third question was the shifting goals for education. I'm really struck by how much people want their kids to go to college, recognizing that the degree is utterly useless. I mean, most of these students are from a rural area. They're going to a second or a third tier institution for a pre-professional degree for which there is no profession associated with it. But it's considered a reasonable expenditure, and again, it demonstrates that your labor is meaningful as much as building a house does, that you paid for education, you fulfilled your responsibility. My goddaughter, for example, got a degree, even a graduate degree. She was offered a research position at her university, which paid less than the cost of sharing a room in the dorm. So there was not, and she was living remotely, there was no way that she could actually make that work. And another neighbor of mine had her daughter move home. She and her husband had been living independently in another region of Ukraine. They chose to return home to economize and use the domestic space that could be easily shared, rather than trying to maintain an independent household elsewhere in Ukraine. So I think you see a desire for that, but a retrenchment into what's economically possible for people to manage. Yes, and now people do say, for the first time, people are turning the key and leaving. I heard that this summer for the first time. I don't know if it's true. I'm gonna wait and see if they come back. But they're just locking their house and leaving and not expecting to come back. Yes?
Are you at liberty to state the name of this village? Don't if you're sure, if you can.
You know, I call the village Apsha, which is a local name for it. It is not the official name for it. And conveniently for me, there's like 5 places in Zakarpattia called Apsha.
Okay, let me tell you why I asked. It looks to me like Studeni, and my Harvard roommate from before your grandmother was born, who unfortunately is no longer with us, was too ill to go to Studeni, which he wanted to do to find the graves of his ancestors, so I did it for him, and it was 2 of the most wonderful days of my life. And it looked very much like
It is not that village, nor is it near that village. So
Okay.
exactly what part of Zakarpattia is that in? Do you
Oh,
remember? What, like a large town that it's near?
what town is it near? You go down to a big town and then you go up the mountain.
Yeah, that's gonna be further, further west. I think it's probably in,
Yeah.
like in the Huskera rayon there. If you go into something and then you go up, it's probably too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but you have hit on something, which is that there's a certain geography that is pretty common. In that part that you've described, you do have to go north to get into the foothills. Here, the foothills are right at the border with Romania.
In 2006, there were a lot of cows. They seem to have shorter legs than.
And they keep the
Yeah.
horns, right?
Yep.
And in 2006, you had a lot of haystacks because you needed to feed all those cows. So the whole complex of labor was oriented towards maintaining that herd, so to speak. I saw very few cows. And I also didn't see people, in some parts of this area, the cows are taken out to pasture together and then they walk home and they just peel off to their individual household without needing anyone to help. They just know where they live. And you don't see that anymore either. I think the herd is too small. I saw one person sitting with his cow while holding the cow while it grazed.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. For me, I feel like I'm one of those last, representatives of a generation that kind of participated in some of that directly or less directly by kind of spending some time with my grandma's and seeing, for instance, weddings and seeing how people actually did a lot of these things, exchanging, bringing, not just food but also utensils or not just silver but all kinds of large and small pots and everything to a wedding and marking them in a specific way so they can retrieve them afterwards and so on. And so it does feel like the village turns now more into a city-like living, and with something that we see in industrialized kind of villages or in the villages of the industrialized West, right? Where kind of those links have been broken to some extent, and people live more kind of in a greater isolation and anonymity. And so what I wonder about though is whether the villagers themselves perceive it as and decry it maybe as something negative or something positive, because what I have seen in my own environment is a lot more ambiguous. That I haven't felt as much kind of negativity from the people when they talk about this. And I was wondering what is the case in Zakarpattia, whether when these women were describing kind of how few cows there are left, whether they were decrying it as something negative or whether they were just kind of saying, well, this is where we are, but kind of at the same time that they were appreciating maybe other opportunities that have emerged.
The condemnation that I heard of it was, first of all, a lot of people talked about that they even said, well, what are we doing with our time? You know, we say we have no time, but what are we doing with it? And someone else is like, we're looking at our phones. Like, they're going through a moment that I think people in the United States went through about 10 years ago, where you realize suddenly that the technology is actually using up your time in a particular way. But when people talk about weddings, there's a lot of there is definitely a tinge of sadness. There's a feeling that it's gone too far. Similarly with houses, that that demonstration of wealth and the continual competition to one-up the previous wedding has reached proportions where it is actually moved past that valued demonstration of your labor to something else, which is not valued, which is excessive. And so I think there's probably, the next wave will be scaling back. Like less is more will be, I can see it coming, right? Less is more will be the next wave. But yeah, definitely people have a negative feeling, and there's a feeling of sort of like I'm missing something, but I don't even remember what it felt like to have those kinds of social relations anymore, and so it's difficult for me to fully understand what I've lost. There's a feeling of loss, but they struggle to identify it, definitely.
Just a comment, I have family in rural western Ukraine, and I watched my cousin got married. I wasn't there, but he showed me this video of his wedding. They're from the village, but it was so elaborate. They had it at a restaurant. It was just like maybe 2 years ago at a restaurant just down the street. I guess it was in Poland actually, but it was like there was like a fog, all sorts of dancing, fireworks, there was just like a new chapter. I've never seen something so elaborate, and this in like a place where 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would never expect it. So I definitely see what you're talking about in terms of how much it's going in this other direction, and people trying to demonstrate their wealth in a very performative way that sort of echoes what's happening in the West. But my questions are, my first question is with the strips of the land. So I'm curious if those strips have any relation to the strips or the plots of land as they were before collectivization. Because I know there was something going on there, and I've never understood if there was a relationship. And then my other question is about the continuation of agricultural labor. Is it something that, to the extent that people are still engaging in it, is it economically necessary, or is it a combination of maybe some economic necessity and a desire to continue the tradition? I'm curious to what extent people are actually using that for subsistence today.
One of the concerns that I actually have, I'm not a medical anthropologist, but I have really noticed a radical shift in the last 10 years in the diet of people in this area. And the main shift is they went from producing a lot of their own food and eating a very, what we might consider a very healthy diet. Lots of vegetarian meals, very low meat diet, lots of vegetable protein and whole grains and so forth. They switched from that to eating a lot of processed sausage as the so that you'll get steamed bread with sausage made with sausage gravy. Like that will be and no vegetables. That will just be put in front of you. And I do think that it's led to exacerbation of ongoing health issues in the area. So I guess I turn it back around and say, how would you define a need for subsistence? Because previously people could either not buy the sausage because it wasn't available, or they could not afford it. So they needed it because there was not an available alternative. Now it might be more cost effective for them to grow their own food and healthier, but it's not a need in the same way because they have alternatives available to them that will allow them to subsist. And so that calculus of that choice and the labor involved is really complex, and I'm curious about what's going on there. In terms of the strips of land, that perception that it was unfair, the way that it was privatized, it was also built in part on a counter narrative of who deserves to receive the land that was collectivized. So one narrative, the dominant one, is that since collectivization was a more fair process than the large landowner sort of tenant farmer structure we had prior to collectivization, it makes sense that your membership in the collective should be the basis of you receiving a strip of land during privatization. And because that was the dominant narrative, that ended up being the way that it was done. it is very different from the way things were done in places like the Baltics, where you could lay claim to land based on a demonstration that you owned it prior to the arrival of Soviet power in that area, and be able to reclaim it on a more powerful prior claim. Those prior claims, the people who ceded their land were either completely embedded themselves within the collective to protect themselves, or left. And so you didn't really have a lot of people who wanted to stand up and say, hey, that was my land, give it all back to me. So it ended up being on the basis of how it was collectivized in the beginning.
I wanted to come back to this earlier question about urbanization, and I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I'm wondering about the, I guess, interaction between the social relations, the changes that you observed, and the spatial changes and the architectural changes. And I don't think it's necessarily productive to ask whether what is causing what, but I think there's an interesting kind of observation to see how those two interrelate, and perhaps also what kind of new spaces emerge. I mean, you can say for one, of course, now where people have big houses and like their own kitchens, they don't have space, communal public spaces where they, you know, interact. But I think that might be a bit too short. Maybe there's some other observations that you can share on that link.
I'm so glad you asked that question. And one reason is that one of the new spaces that was developed in the mid-2000s was actually an internal kitchen. That prior to that, the vast majority of houses did not have any internal cooking space. In the living space, they would have a stove that was used for heating, and you could cook on top of it, but most of the cooking was done in another building. And part of modernization was to introduce a kitchen space. So in the house that I usually live in, they took a storage area and carved out a kitchen with a little set of cabinets and a little electric stove that was put into this space and turned into a kitchen. So the addition of a kitchen, that's actually a new space, the internal kitchen, modeled on sort of an apartment in an urban area. The other, more importantly, what I see happening with social relations is the traditional, since the mid-20th century, the traditional life cycle progression is that you are the head of household, and at a certain point you move into the summer kitchen as your primary residence. So it's like there's one room for cooking and one back room for sleeping in. You become the older generation, you move into that space and you cede ownership of the house and running of the household to one of the children in the family. What happened is that people made that transition, and then their children built a new house. So they have a house that sits empty and they live in the summer kitchen. And the traditional system of supporting aging as people move through the life cycle has also started to erode. It's caused, I'm not going to say it's caused problems, but you have this weird phenomenon of a large house built in the 1970s that is sitting empty, and people living in the summer kitchen adjacent to it in a very small footprint space. But because someone has built a house to their specifications, you have this empty, misaligned space that is not usable. No one wants to knock down that house, but no one wants to live in that house, and so it's kind of in limbo. And that limbo is eminently related to social relations, and it affects how people live. So for me, that's a really interesting place to explore. It has a lot of consequences for how people live their lives.
I think you mentioned that in the perception of the locals, the idea is that the age of gazdas is sort of coming back. And I wonder that the money that comes from migrant labor, whether that goes into maybe building local businesses, and also probably contributes to social differentiation, and probably people have different type of houses. You showed the house in the neighboring village, which looks like castle, and again, whether people who have businesses and more money that they build in a particular neighborhood, or just they build wherever their parents lived. So again, we are in a situation where again a lot changed in terms of the social inequality, and how that plays out in your village.
So You asked a really fascinating question, which I'd never thought of posing that way, which is, where do people build? And because there was a restriction on reselling land for a certain period after the plots were privatized, people built where they got a piece of land. So sometimes they subdivided and they built right next to where their parents lived, but more often they received a plot that was somewhat distant from where they had grown up. And so, and you can have someone with that broken down house with the roof caving in, but they still are occupying that space, and the next one over is a palace that someone has built. That social stratification is not quite developed into neighborhoods. However, if, for example, you happen to be the head of the forestry, combinat up on the mountain, and you happen to live in the village, you might find yourself able to create a compound that pulls together 4 plots of land, and you might find yourself able to, do things with that space that differentiate you quite starkly from other people. But to answer your question about small business owners, most of the people in the village who have a great deal of capital are clientes, so they're people who are jobs brokers. They manage laborers for migrant for businesses in Czech Republic and Slovakia. And they got into that business very early on. So they're 20 years in, and no one else can break in, right? They have a lock on that. And their relatives or people who also engaged in trading, many of them were able to get seed capital to be able to open a restaurant or some other kind of business in the village that makes them part of the elite. So I think part of it is how early on were you able to invest and create that space and live through the period when it wasn't really a moneymaker, so that now you can be part of that business elite in the village.
May I ask a follow-up
Absolutely.
question? In terms of the village elite, whether there is a change from elite from before 1991 and what is happening today, or good part of the old elite transformed into a new one?
So one of the things that drove my friend who's the director of the school completely crazy is that the richest people are the ones who got the threes, right? They were the mediocre students, but because they were mediocre students, instead of going on to study with their gold medal and their red diploma, they went to engage in migrant labor and were able to be the foundational members of that class of people who had all of the connections. They are not necessarily, they were not necessarily the children of the head of the kolkhoz or anything like that. They happened to get in on the ground floor. I will say, however, that if you were in a particular position, like if you were that surveyor, or if you were the head of the village, Rada at that time, you had access to capital that would then enable you to invest in ways that other people did not have access to. So if people were paying under the table $300 to $500 to get one of these plots of land here, at that time that was an enormous amount of money that those two people were able to divide amongst themselves and use for other purposes. Yes?
One more question about another step in modernization, building in toilets and bathrooms. And another would be about the role of the church. Is it changing within this period of time with different waves of labor migration, or it is stable?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the bathrooms, I know of one flush toilet in this entire village. And I know because I visit that woman for a reason, right? Just every once in a while you want to have a flush toilet. But so people have created literal bathrooms, like rooms where they can bathe and have hot water, hot running water that comes from a tank, and do washing inside, but very few of them have plumbing. So most people still use an outhouse for a toilet. Which is sort of incongruous, right? Similarly, there's no gas in this village, so everything is electricity. All of the appliances, everything is electricity. In terms of the church, So this is so the next village over switched quite dramatically to the Kiev Patriarchat. This one has adamantly refused, the parishioners themselves refused to switch. And not surprisingly, I think I'm not going to call it a schism, but a lot of people have stopped going to church. So I would say that I went there for a holiday, and where I would have expected the church to be full, and it was relatively empty. And I think a lot of people were staying away out of protest. There's sort of some bad feelings around that. But what has been made possible, when I arrived, they had just covered the church. So it was in 1994 they covered the church, but it was not fully stuccoed, and it didn't have the nice golden dome, like they didn't have the paintings on the inside. So what has happened over the years is that patrons who engage in migrant labor will pay for paintings, or will pay for vestments, or will pay for the bjaka that goes on the roof. And that has resulted in a very nice church over time. And all of that is migrant labor money. Without that, the church would not be there, nor would it look the way that it does.
Yeah. Can you talk a little more, you mentioned in the beginning that there is a kind of sense of national identity as well. So can you talk a little bit more about that, and also the relationship, if there's a kind of general one, with the state? I mean, is there like a sense that these villages are kind of abandoned by the state and they have to make do for themselves, or is there like a protection to not feel like that because there is already a kind of sense of self-sufficiency?
Well, it's Zakarpattia, and there's a very particular relationship to government in Zakarpattia that is highly local, and it's sort of like we would call it a machine. There are regional political machines, and I would say that things, for example, the issue of the roads, which are consistently rated as the worst in Ukraine, and they are truly terrible. It is almost impossible to drive on them. I was a monitor for the elections in March, and we could not go to a village I had gone to in 2014 because the road was impassable. So there's a whole village that no one can get to because you can't drive on the road. I don't know what they do up there, but I think they have those they just drive giant trucks up there. But the issue of who's responsible for the roads is like it goes around and around and around, because they'll say we're responsible for the roads inside the town, but someone else is responsible for the roads between the towns, right? So, and then someone who's supposed to be responsible for the road between the town will say no. Each village at either end of the road should be paying equally to pay for the road that's in the middle. So I think roads are a place where they really feel the pain of neglect from the government and the pain of corruption, essentially. I think another area where people feel it is in lack of, and I can say I see this too. You know, I was just on a trip to Kiev, and I went to a number of schools. They're just regular, everyday state-run schools, and I was appalled at the level of quality in the furniture and the floors and everything compared to what I see in rural areas. So they also feel that as well, lack of funding for education.
I think that's our cue, maybe, that it's time to take our work around and wrap up.
Okay, so the wedding probably is
Just the wedding,
going.
waiting for us, yeah.
And I have to say, someone was saying,